This is a harmony textbook written by Tchaikovsky in 1871 during his time as a music professor at the Moscow Conservatory. He begins the book with a run-through of all the basics: scales, chords, intervals, and the general theory of harmony in Western tonal music. Things get a bit more complicated as we flip through these pages, and one thing that caught my eye is this, a section titled Chords of the Minor and Diminished Seventh. As regards their resolution, these chords are treated as chords of the ninth without fundamental tone. Their third, consequently, of their fundamental tone, the third. Okay, what the f does this mean? Well, Tchaikovsky is basically telling us that this chord here is just another offshoot of one of the most common sounds in Western music, the authentic cadence. In short, this chord is said to have a dominant function, which just means that it creates tension that quote-unquote needs to be resolved in a specific way. And so Tchaikovsky instructs us to just treat this chord as we would a normal dominant 5 chord, and resolve it to the tonic, or basically the home base of the key that we're in. The other function this chord serves is a predominant one, meaning it comes before a dominant chord in order to establish a progression, specifically in the minor key. Tchaikovsky seems to neglect this function in his book, despite using the chord in this way in his own compositions. These are the two ways that these chords are said to function, dominantly and predominantly. So when the composer Richard Wagner wrote the prelude to his opera Tristan and Isolde, and gave the world this for an opening, no one knew what to make of this chord. But wait, isn't this just a half-diminished 7th chord? The one Tchaikovsky was just explaining to us? Well, yes, sort of. This chord, now famously just called the Tristan chord, is identical sounding to the half-diminished 7 chord. I say identical sounding because there's something different about the Tristan chord, something that has caused music theorists and composers to argue about it to no end. So what is so astonishing about Wagner's Tristan chord that it prompted this? Before we continue, I just want to mention really quick that if you enjoy the video, please remember to like and subscribe, and if you're feeling especially generous, consider supporting the channel through my Buy Me a Coffee page. This lets you guys support me directly through one-time contributions, so no monthly signups or anything, and any support whatsoever goes a long way for the channel. The link to that is in the description. Thank you. So why don't we just call Wagner's Tristan chord a half-diminished 7th chord and move on with our lives? Good question. Well, it's because of the fact that, in theory, these half-diminished chords are only supposed to function in those two ways that we talked about, dominantly and predominantly. So this chord Wagner wrote should either resolve to an F-sharp major, functioning dominantly, or be part of a 2-5-1 progression in E-flat minor, functioning predominantly. Of course, it does neither of these things, and instead goes to an E7 chord, which has convinced some listeners that the chord can't possibly be a half-diminished chord. And what's perhaps even more confusing about the sequence is not the sequence itself, but instead what follows it. Complete silence. Usually for about 8 to 10 seconds. Now this doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it can really be felt while you're listening to it. And when the music finally is brought back in, we pretty much get the same phrase, but modulated up a minor third. This is the opposite of a resolution, and it just adds to the tension that Wagner created with the first phrase. This type of opening to an opera was something that audiences at the time were not accustomed to. And you don't have to look any further than Verdi, one of Wagner's contemporaries, to understand just how different this was. This Verity overture opens with a clear key center and a discernible melody. It doesn't lend itself to the same ambiguity that the opening of Tristan does. This difference is what made the Tristan chord, and by extension the entire 4-hour opera, which saves its resolution till the very end, so interesting and controversial. So, if it's not a half-diminished 7th chord, what is it? And why are we still arguing about it? Composers are often quite deliberate about how they spell chords, and Wagner doesn't spell this chord like a typical 19th century composer would spell a half-diminished 7th chord. A half-diminished 7th chord would be root, minor 3rd, diminished 5th, and minor 7th, whereas the Tristan chord is spelled root, augmented 2nd, augmented 4th, and augmented 6th. I think this spelling is different enough to where it's safe to say that Wagner didn't just have one too many schnapps and accidentally misspell an ordinary half-diminished 7th chord. Instead, the spelling he chose seems quite deliberate and exemplifies some important voice leading that gives us insight into the first and probably most popular theory for the Tristan chord. This augmented 6th interval in particular draws the attention of most music theorists because it has different implications than a minor 7th when it comes to analyzing the chord. The purpose of this spelling is that it makes both the top and bottom voices leading tones into the octave. Essentially, both voices want to resolve outward in contrary motion to the same note. This is the basic function of what we call augmented 6th chords. And there's 3 kinds of these chords: French, Italian, and German. And with F as our root note, this is how all of those would be spelled. The one that's really of interest to us is the French one. Listen to it side by side with the Tristan chord. Pretty similar sounding. The only enharmonic difference is the first interval. In the French augmented 6th chord, it's a major 3rd. In the Tristan chord, it's an augmented 2nd. Let's listen to the Tristan progression one more time and keep an eye and an ear on that G sharp. The G sharp actually moves to an A at the end of the measure, making the interval a major 3rd and satisfying the criteria for a French augmented 6th chord, albeit briefly. This right here encapsulates the first theory about the Tristan chord. The chord is just a French augmented 6th chord with an appoggiatura. In other words, the G sharp isn't really a part of the chord, but it's instead a leading tone to the note that is part of the chord, A, which would actually sort of explain why he spelled it as a G sharp instead of an A flat. During the course of this video, I reached out to a couple music teachers about this to see what their opinions would be, and many of them favor the French 6 explanation. An observation from one of these teachers that I found particularly interesting was this. Someone might say that the G sharp is held too long to be an appoggiatura, but I think not. If Wagner had extended the A sharp over the E7 chord that follows for as long a time before it resolves to the B as the G sharp is extended before it resolves to the A in the Tristan chord, no one would entertain the slightest doubt that the chord is E7. For the same reason, Wagner can hold that G sharp for as long as he wants before resolving it to the A, without undermining the nature of the chord itself. I think this is a great point, which is that the E7 chord is really never called into question, even though it has an appoggiatura of its own, which could have been even longer and still recognizable as an E7 chord. And speaking of that E7, what really strengthens the case for this chord being an augmented 6th is the consideration of its function. Augmented chords are usually used to approach dominant chords, or cadential 6/4 chords, and the Tristan chord does end up moving to an E dominant 7 chord. However, if we commit ourselves to saying that this is an augmented 6 chord, that means we're saying that this sequence is in A minor, which is debatable because we never get any resolution to A minor, and instead get that modulation that we listened to earlier. And even for those who do see it as an augmented 6th chord, they don't necessarily see it as a French augmented 6th chord. I find it frankly impossible to hear this note as an appoggiatura, and I'm inclined to think that this is reason good enough to question any analysis that commands me to do so. Alright, fair enough. The author of this paper, Nathan Martin, believes that the chord is its own species of augmented 6th chord. Not French, not German, nor Italian, but a Tristan augmented 6th chord. I wasn't able to find many who agree with his particular position, but what Martin is essentially saying is that the chord does function in nearly the same way that an augmented 6th chord would function. It just contains a different set of notes in between the actual augmented 6th interval. And after walking the reader through a relatively obscure theoretical conception of dissonance that was presented in a text from 1853, Martin concludes that we can simply admit an additional category of augmented sixth chord, and brings the matter to a close. Again, I had trouble finding this idea elsewhere, but there is a whole community of people who believe that there really is no way to discuss the chord in terms of music theory or functionality. To them, the chord is an important step in Western music that needs to be appreciated but need not be analyzed. We'll visit this concept again later. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I don't really understand this one. I believe it has something to do with taking into account an analysis of the opera as a whole, rather than just looking at the opening gesture. Now, that sounds like a smart thing to do, but I'm not a fan of opera in general, and can't really bring myself to sit through the full 4 hours to come to my own conclusions about these things. I'm also not half as intelligent as the people who've already argued about this for 2 centuries, so I'm sure I can defer to the comments section to judge the merits of each of these ideas. And also, if you're interested, every source that I use to research for this video will be listed in the description. To understand this theory, you really only need to listen to the very beginning and the very end of the opera, which makes it a lot more palatable for me than the last one. Jokes aside though, this is an interesting theory that puts forward the idea that in the context of the beginning and the end of the opera, the chord should really be seen as a B major sixth chord with a flattened fifth. Wagner reveals this to us at the very end of the opera, where we hear the Tristan chord for the last time. This time, its context is much different, and where it leads is more conclusive, which gives us the opportunity for a new explanation. Proponents of this theory would analyze the progression like this. The Tristan chord, now with the B in its bass voice, is a B major with a flattened fifth. This leads into an E minor chord, which then gives us an unmistakable minor plagal cadence into the tonic of B major. The YouTube channel Stratasound has a great, concise video on this topic, and they take the view that
it is a tonic chord in second inversion in the key of B major. It is as simple as that.
I alluded to this earlier, but there is also a general attitude among a lot of people who argue about this chord that it really isn't worth the time or energy, because it doesn't need to be understood in the light of functional harmonic analysis. And I think this is a good point. Who's to say that Wagner didn't just think the chord sounded cool and so that's why he wrote it? Maybe we don't need an explanation of why, if you listen to bar 45 of the Prelude of the second act and then compare it to bar 12 of the finale and then flip all the music upside down, then you can clearly see that Wagner meant for this to be a G double flat half-diminished chord. No. It seems more like the important thing about this chord is what it did to our understanding of tonality and form. It gave the composers that followed a platform to stand on when it came to expanding the language of classical music. One of the teachers that I reached out to remarked that the more important thing is the fact that people are still arguing about it to this day. The particular correct analysis is an unanswerable question.